The world, for Anjali, had shrunk to the size of a stained Formica tabletop. At 28, her universe wasn't made of stars and possibilities, but of the sticky, caffeine-scented reality of the Sunrise Diner. This was the place where dreams came to die, quietly, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the clatter of cheap cutlery. Her life was a loop, a worn-out record playing the same tired song day after day. Each morning began before the sun, the chilly floorboards of her small apartment a familiar shock to her bare feet. In the next room, her 6-year-old daughter slept peacefully, a small, warm island in the cold sea of Anjali's worries. Getting ready was a military operation of hushed movements and quiet efficiency. A quick breakfast, a gentle wake-up for her daughter, a rush to the bus stop, and then the first of 2 shifts at the diner. The weight of it all sat permanently on her shoulders, a heavy, invisible coat. Her feet ached constantly, a dull throb that started in her arches and climbed up her legs by midday. Her hands, though scrubbed clean 100 times, always seemed to carry the faint, ghostly scent of dish soap and fried onions. She moved through the diner with a practiced, tired grace, her body remembering the steps even when her mind wanted to shut down. "More coffee, hun." "You need a refill on that soda?" "Can I get you the check?" The words were automatic, a script she knew by heart. Underneath her bed, back in the quiet of her apartment, was a notebook filled with lyrics and a beat-up acoustic guitar with a chipped corner. It was a ghost. It was the ghost of the person Anjali used to be, a girl who believed her voice could reach farther than the clatter of a kitchen. She used to play in small coffee houses, her fingers dancing on the strings, weaving stories about the people she saw. Now, the guitar mostly collected dust. Sometimes, late at night when her daughter was asleep and the silence of the apartment felt too loud, she would pull it out. She'd strum a few chords, a melody that felt both familiar and strange, and the ache in her heart would become a sharp, sudden pain. It was the pain of a locked door, a path not taken. The dream hadn't just faded. It had become a cruel reminder of the life she had lost to circumstance. She kept working for her daughter, for the bright, hopeful eyes that looked at her like she was a superhero. Every tip was a small victory in the war against rent, daycare, and the endless stack of bills that seemed to multiply on their own. Each paycheck was a frantic race, a frantic calculation, a constant prayer that there would be enough. The people who came to the diner were like background characters in the movie of her life. The construction workers, who always ordered the same breakfast platter. The old man who read the newspaper from front to back every single afternoon. The young couples on awkward first dates. She saw them, but she didn't really see them anymore. They were just part of the scenery, part of the grind. One Tuesday afternoon, the sky was a dull, weeping gray. A slow, steady rain drummed on the diner's roof, making the small space feel even more cramped and humid. The afternoon lull had set in, the pointy end of the day when exhaustion hit the hardest. Anjali was wiping down a counter, her mind a blank, when something caught her eye through the grease-streaked window. It was a car. Not just any car, but a long black town car so sleek and polished it looked like it had driven out of another world. It slid to a stop right in front of the diner, its dark finish a stark contrast to the drab, wet street, the regulars noticed. A few heads lifted from their plates, forks pausing mid-air. The cook, a big, burly man named Raj, peered through the order window, his eyebrows raised. It was an event, an interruption in the rhythm of their ordinary day. A hush seemed to fall over the diner, a collective holding of breath. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and wore a suit that looked like it cost more than Anjali made in 3 months. The charcoal gray fabric was perfectly tailored, not a single wrinkle in sight despite the rain. He didn't carry an umbrella, and the water beat it up and rolled off his coat like it was afraid to touch him. As he walked toward the diner door, the atmosphere inside changed. It felt charged, like the air before a storm. He pushed the door open, and the little bell above it jingled, a sound that was usually cheerful but now seemed small and insignificant. The man paused just inside, his sharp eyes sweeping across the room. He wasn't just looking. He was assessing, analyzing. His gaze made Anjali feel like a bug under a microscope. Everyone in the diner suddenly found their plates intensely interesting. This was a predator, or at least a creature from a different food chain, and they were all just prey. This was Vikram Roy. Though no one in the diner knew his name, they knew the type. He was famously ruthless. A venture capitalist who turned clever ideas into empires and was known for leaving a trail of discarded people in his wake. His face was one Anjali had seen once or twice on the covers of financial magazines in the grocery store. A face that looked like it was carved from granite. He ignored the empty booths and walked directly toward a small two-person table right in the middle of her section. Anjali's heart gave a nervous thump. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and walked over. Her tablet held in front of her like a shield. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice a little too high. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Vikram Roy didn't even look at the laminated menu she offered. His eyes were fixed on her. They were a dark, piercing gray, and they seemed to see right through her tired smile. "Black coffee," he said. His voice was low and smooth, but it held no warmth. It was the voice of command. "Certainly. I'll be right back with that." Anjali practically fled to the coffee station. Her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed a clean mug. She could feel his eyes on her back, tracking her every move. She poured the coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the cold air. When she returned, he hadn't moved. He just watched her place the mug on the table, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, then dismissed her with a slight nod of his head. Anjali went back to her station, but she couldn't focus. She busied herself by wiping down already clean tables, rearranging the sugar dispensers, anything to avoid looking in his direction. The man was a black hole in the center of her small universe, sucking all the air out of the room. For the next hour, he did nothing but drink his coffee and watch. He watched the cook, the other customers, the way the light hit the vinyl seats. He was a silent, powerful presence, and with every passing minute, the knot in Anjali's stomach grew tighter. She had a terrible sinking feeling that this man, this millionaire from another world, was about to turn her life upside down. She just didn't know how. For the next hour, Anjali felt like an actor in a play she hadn't rehearsed. Every move she made seemed scripted, watched, judged. She wiped a counter that was already clean, refilled the salt shakers with a shaking hand, and tried to look busy, but her mind was a frantic, buzzing hive of thoughts. Why was he still here? He had finished his single cup of coffee 20 minutes ago. Most customers who stayed that long were either lonely people seeking refuge or troublemakers looking for a reason to complain. Anjali couldn't figure out which category he fell into, and the uncertainty was eating away at her. The other patrons, too, seemed to be holding their breath. The usual noisy chatter of the diner had softened to a low murmur. The old man who always read the newspaper had folded it and was now pretending to stir his cold coffee, his eyes darting toward the man in the suit every few seconds. Even Raj, the cook, was unusually quiet, his face a mask of stone as he peeked through the serving window. It was as if Vikram Roy's presence had created a silent bubble around his table, a space where the normal rules of the diner didn't apply. Anjali's anxiety was a physical thing, a tight band squeezing her chest. She kept picturing her daughter's face, imagining the phone call to her boss, the possibility of being fired because this important, powerful man decided her service wasn't good enough. What if he complained about the way she walked, or the stain on her apron, or the fact that she'd forgotten to bring him more water? Her mind raced through 1,000 worst-case scenarios, each one more disastrous than the last. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, Vikram Roy placed his empty coffee cup back on its saucer. The small clink of porcelain against ceramic cut through the quiet hum of the diner like a gunshot. Anjali's head snapped up. He was looking directly at her, and with a slight, almost imperceptible lift of his chin, he beckoned her over. Her legs felt like lead. It was the longest walk of her life, a journey of 20 feet across cracked linoleum that felt more like a tightrope walk over a canyon. The eyes of every customer followed her. She could feel their curiosity, their pity, their fear that she might be the one to cause a scene. She tried to smooth her expression into a neutral, pleasant mask, but she knew her eyes were wide with fear. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She kept her hands clasped behind her back, her knuckles white. Was there anything else I could get for you? Vikram Roy didn't answer right away. He simply looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt like it was stripping away every layer of her defenses. He saw the tiredness in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the cheap polyester of her uniform. He saw everything, and Anjali had never felt so exposed in her entire life. The service was adequate, he said, his voice as smooth and cold as a stone in winter. The word adequate hung in the air between them, a dismissal that was somehow worse than a direct insult. He wasn't angry. He was merely unimpressed. Anjali's heart sank. This was it. The complaint was coming, but then he did something she didn't expect. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, new $100 bill, placing it on the table next to his empty cup. Then he slid a clean, white napkin across the table. Along with the cheap, plastic pen the diner provided for customers to sign their credit card receipts. I believe in rewarding potential. Not just performance, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. But potential has to be proven. So I'm going to give you a test. Anjali stared at the $100 bill, then at the napkin, her mind completely blank. A test? What kind of test was this? Was he some kind of prankster? Was there a hidden camera? Her first instinct was to back away, to say, no, thank you, and to escape back to the familiar safety of the kitchen. But something held her in place, a mixture of fear and a tiny, stubborn spark of curiosity. I want you to write something for me, he said, his tone clinical as if he were explaining a business proposition. In one sentence on that napkin, tell me something you observe in this diner that no one else does. Something honest. Not a complaint about the food or the service, not a clever suggestion for the menu, but an observation. Tell me what you see. The request was so strange, so out of left field, that for a moment Anjali thought she must have misheard him. He wanted her to write a sentence? For $100? It seemed like a trick, a trap. The pressure was immense. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention, the silent expectation of the room. Her boss was watching. The customers were watching. This cold, powerful man was watching, and what if I can't think of anything? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of Vikram Roy's lips. Then the service was simply adequate, and I'll leave you the standard tip. But if I find what you write valuable, the $100 is yours? The choice is yours? He leaned back in his chair, his body language relaxed, but his eyes were sharp as daggers. He had put her on the spot, just as he intended. Her entire livelihood, her dignity, was now resting on the quality of a single sentence. Panic began to bubble in her chest. Her mind, which moments ago had been racing with worst-case scenarios, was now suddenly and terrifyingly empty. An observation? What could she possibly write that would impress a man like him? She could write about the wobbly leg on table 3, or the way the neon sign outside flickered erratically, spelling _knee diner for a few seconds every minute. She could write about the squeak of the swinging door to the kitchen, a sound so familiar she no longer heard it, but those were all surface things. Things anyone could notice. They were complaints, observations of the mundane. He had specifically said no complaints. He wanted something deeper, something honest. Her eyes scanned the room, desperate for inspiration. She saw the retired schoolteacher tracing the rim of her teacup, lost in a memory. She saw a young couple on a first date, their conversation a clumsy dance of nervous laughter and awkward silences. She saw a trucker sitting alone, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, a deep and profound loneliness in his eyes. These were the people she wrote songs about in another life. These were the stories she used to see. But now, under this immense pressure, her creative spirit felt paralyzed. All she could think about was failure, about looking foolish. The $100 was a temptation, but the fear of his judgment was a much stronger force. She took a deep breath, the smell of stale coffee and fried onions filling her lungs. She had to say something. She couldn't just stand there like a statue. She thought of the hundreds of stories she had told herself about these people, the secret lives she had imagined for them. And then she thought of the music that always played softly from the old jukebox in the corner. A particular song, a sad, weeping ballad about lost love, seemed to be on a constant loop, especially on rainy afternoons like this one. No one ever requested it. No one ever sang along. They just let it play, a soundtrack to their own private sadness, slowly. With a hand that was still not quite steady, Anjali reached out and picked up the plastic pen. It felt light and flimsy in her fingers. She looked at the blank, white napkin. It was a small, insignificant stage, but on it she had to perform the most important act of her life. She uncapped the pen, the cheap plastic making a faint clicking sound that seemed to echo in the silent diner. The cheap plastic pen felt small and fragile in Anjali's hand, a flimsy tool for a task that suddenly felt monumental. The white napkin was a blank canvas, a tiny stage, and the entire diner was holding its breath, waiting for her to perform. She could feel Vikram Roy's gaze like a physical weight, pinning her in place. The $100 bill lay on the table, a silent promise, a silent threat. Her mind, which had been a frantic, panicked mess just moments before, began to slow down. It was like a noisy, crowded room suddenly emptying out, leaving only a single, clear thought. She thought about the jukebox in the corner, the big, colorful machine that hadn't been updated since the late 90s. It was a relic? A dinosaur in a world of streaming playlists and Bluetooth speakers. Anjali had worked at the Sunrise Diner for 5 years, and in that time she had learned its secrets. She knew which table was the most wobbly, which stool had the most comfortable cushion, and she knew the jukebox's secret. The machine had a mind of its own. It played what it wanted to play. But on rainy days, especially slow, melancholic afternoons like this one, it had a favorite dot. It was a song by an old, forgotten singer, a simple ballad with a weeping melody and lyrics about love that had slipped away like sand through your fingers. The singer's voice was thin and full of aching regret, a perfect match for the gray sky outside. The song was a sad, beautiful wound. The first time Anjali had really listened to it, she had been having a particularly bad day. A bill she couldn't pay had arrived in the mail, and her daughter had been sick with a fever. She had been wiping down a table when the song started, and the first few notes had stopped her cold. It felt like the song was being sung just for her, a perfect soundtrack to her quiet despair. Since then, she had noticed it playing on other rainy days. It would just appear in the rotation, unchosen and unrequested, and she had started watching the other customers when it played. The old man reading the newspaper would suddenly look up, a faraway, pained look in his eyes. The young couple on their first date would fall silent, their earlier nervous energy replaced by a shared, unspoken sadness. The lonely trucker would stare into his coffee, his shoulders slumping just a little bit more. They all heard it. Anjali knew they did, but no one ever acknowledged it. No one ever said, "Oh, I love this song," or "This song always makes me sad." They all just sat there, pretending not to hear, letting the music wash over them like a shared secret they could never speak aloud. It was a collective, silent agreement to ignore the sadness that connected them all. They were all in the same storm, but everyone was pretending they were in their own separate boats. That was it. That was the observation. It wasn't about the sticky tables or the mediocre coffee. It was about the invisible thread of sadness that tied them all together on days like this. It was about the song everyone heard but nobody listened to. Her hand, which had been trembling with anxiety, suddenly felt calm. A sense of certainty washed over her, a quiet confidence that she had never felt in this diner before. She didn't know if it was what Vikram Roy wanted to hear. It wasn't a clever business idea or a sharp, witty comment. It was just true. And for the first time in a long time, her own truth felt like enough. She leaned over the table, the pen hovering just above the napkin. The diner was so quiet she could hear the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the rain still tapping against the window. She didn't look at Vikram Roy. She focused only on the small white square in front of her. She wrote the words slowly, her handwriting neat and clear. A stark contrast to the chaos in her mind just moments before. The ink flowed from the cheap pen, dark and permanent on the paper. She wrote about the song, the sadness, and the silence. It was one sentence, just as he had asked. When she was finished, she read it over one more time. It was simple, but it felt right. It felt like her. Carefully, she capped the pen and placed it back on the table. She folded the napkin neatly in half, creasing the edge with her thumb, just like she folded her daughter's letters from school. She placed the folded napkin next to the untouched $100 bill. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She had done her part. Now it was his turn. Without looking at him again, Anjali turned and walked away. She didn't scurry back to the kitchen like she wanted to. She forced herself to walk slowly, her back straight, her head held high. She could feel his eyes on her, but this time it didn't feel like a judgment. It felt like a consideration. She went back to her station by the coffee machine, her heart thumping a heavy rhythmic beat against her ribs. She picked up a clean rag and began to wipe the counter, her movements slow and deliberate, trying to act normal, trying to disappear. The whole room was still watching. What would he do? Would he laugh? Would he crumple up the napkin and throw it on the floor in disgust? Would he just get up and leave, taking the $100 with him? Anjali braced herself for the rejection, telling herself it didn't matter, that it was just a silly game. But it did matter. It mattered more than she wanted to admit. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Vikram Roy was unfolding the napkin. He read the single sentence, his face unreadable. He held the paper in his hand for a long time, his eyes fixed on her words. Anjali's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't look away. She saw something flicker in his eyes, a tiny spark of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't amusement. It was recognition. He looked up from the napkin and his eyes met hers across the room. For a split second, the cold, hard mask of the venture capitalist seemed to melt away, and she saw something else in his expression, something that looked surprisingly like understanding. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The mask was back in place. He carefully folded the napkin, slid it into his suit jacket pocket, and then placed the $100 bill on top of his receipt. He stood up, straightening his already perfect suit. He didn't look at Anjali again. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked out of the diner, the little bell above the door jingling softly as he disappeared into the rain, leaving behind only the scent of expensive cologne and $100 bill on the table. The silence in the diner stretched for a moment after the door swung shut. Then all at once the noise rushed back in. The low hum of conversation rose to its normal level. The clatter of plates from the kitchen returned. The spell was broken. Anjali let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her legs felt weak. She walked over to the table to clear it. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the $100 bill. It was just paper, but it felt like so much more. She looked at the empty space where the napkin had been, the spot where her words had been. He had taken it. He hadn't left it behind. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew one thing for sure. Her first note had changed something. The little bell above the diner door stopped jingling, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise before it. Anjali stood frozen by the table, the crisp $100 bill clutched in her hand. It felt unreal, like a prop from a play that had just ended. He was gone. The powerful, intimidating man who had turned her world upside down for an hour had vanished back into the rain, leaving only the scent of his expensive cologne and a $100 bill that felt both like a victory and a mystery. She stared at the empty space where the napkin had been. He took it. Why would he take it? It was just a silly sentence written on a cheap piece of paper. Was it a trophy? A joke he'd share with his powerful friends? A piece of evidence of her inadequacy? The question swirled in her mind, a dizzying storm. The $100 was a comfort, a tangible relief. It would cover the overdue electricity bill and buy her daughter a new pair of shoes she desperately needed. But it was the missing napkin that truly haunted her. It was an unanswered question hanging in the air. The diner was slowly returning to its normal rhythm. The retired teacher went back to her tea. The cook, Raj, gave Anjali a final, curious look before disappearing back into his kitchen world of sizzling pans and clanging metal. The spell was broken and the Sunrise Diner was just the Sunrise Diner again? But for Anjali, something had fundamentally shifted. The walls of her small world felt a little less solid, the ceiling a little higher. She finished her shift in a daze, her body moving on autopilot while her mind replayed the scene over and over again. Every customer she served, every table she wiped, she saw the man's intense gray eyes and the unreadable expression on his face as he read her words. When she finally got home that night, long after her daughter was asleep, she didn't pull out her guitar. She just sat in the quiet of her small living room, turning the $100 bill over and over in her fingers. It was more than money. It was a puzzle. The next 2 days were a blur of routine, which was both a comfort and a frustration. She went back to the Sunrise Diner, back to the sticky tables and the lukewarm coffee, but everything felt different. She looked at the customers differently now. She saw the trucker not just as a tip but as a man with a story. She saw the young couple not as an order of cheeseburgers and fries, but as two people at the beginning of something. Her songwriter's eyes, which had been clouded by exhaustion and cynicism, were starting to clear. The note she had written had woken something up inside her, a part of her she thought had died. She started humming little melodies to herself as she worked, fragments of songs she hadn't thought about in years. She tried to convince herself that the whole thing was a strange, one-time event, a rich man's bizarre game, a story to tell someday, but nothing more. He was gone and he wasn't coming back. Life went on. The bills kept coming. The grind continued. But a tiny, stubborn part of her held onto the image of him taking the napkin. That one small action felt important, a loose thread that, if she pulled it, might unravel something entirely unexpected. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, the bell above the door jingled. Anjali didn't look up at first, busy refilling the sugar dispensers. But a shadow fell over her station, and she felt a strange sense of familiarity. She looked up and saw a man standing there. He wasn't Vikram Roy. This man was younger, maybe in his late 30s. He was also dressed in a nice, well-fitting suit, but he had a gentler, more open face. He carried a leather briefcase and looked around the diner with a polite curiosity, not the cold assessment of his boss. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft and clear. "Are you Anjali?" Anjali's heart did a nervous little flip. No one ever asked for her by name at the diner, except for her boss when she was in trouble. "Yes, I am," she said, her voice tight with apprehension. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, a warm, genuine smile that didn't quite reach his worried eyes. "My name is Amit," he said. "I work for Mr. Roy Vikram Roy." The name sent a jolt through her. So it wasn't over. This was it. The other shoe was about to drop. She braced herself, her mind racing. Was he here to complain? To ask for the money back? To fire her? I don't understand, Anjali managed to say, her hands instinctively gripping the edge of the counter behind her. "I know this is very unusual," Amit said, his tone reassuring. "And I apologize for interrupting your work. Could we perhaps speak for a moment?" He gestured to an empty booth in the corner. Feeling like she was walking to the principal's office, Anjali followed him and slid onto the worn vinyl seat. Amit sat opposite her, placing his briefcase neatly on the table. He didn't beat around the bush. "The reason I'm here is because of the note you wrote for Mr. Roy," he began. "The note about the jukebox." Anjali felt a flush of heat on her neck. "Oh, was it not what he wanted?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Amit shook his head, a serious expression on his face. "On the contrary, it was exactly what he was looking for. Perhaps more than he was looking for." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What you need to understand about Mr. Roy is that he doesn't see things the way other people do. He built his entire career on his ability to see value where no one else does. Not just in business plans, but in perspectives. He believes that the most powerful ideas, the most profound insights don't come from boardrooms. They come from real life. From people who are paying attention." Anjali just stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Your note," Lee continued, "it wasn't just an observation. It was poetry. It was a complete story in a single sentence. It showed him that you see more than just what's on the surface. You see the stories underneath. That is a very rare and very valuable skill in Mr. Roy's world. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. After you left, Mr. Roy was impressed. Genuinely impressed. That doesn't happen often. He was curious. So he did some research. He learned that you used to be a songwriter, that you played in small clubs before this. Anjali felt a pang of an old, familiar sadness. It was so strange to hear her past life spoken about by a man in a suit in a diner. It felt like talking about someone else. The note wasn't a test of your waitressing skills, Anjali, Amit said, his voice softening. It was a test of your soul, of your spirit, and you passed. You showed him a spark he hadn't seen in a very long time. He slid the folder across the table. Anjali hesitated before opening it. Inside there was a letter printed on heavy, expensive paper, and tucked into the flap of the envelope was a business card. The letter was from Vikram Roy. It was short, direct, and completely stunning. It wasn't a check. It was an offer. Vikram Roy, the man who seemed to have everything, was offering to fund a professional recording session for her. A real one in a world-class studio with a top producer. He wanted to hear what those stories she saw sounded like as songs. The letter also stated that he had arranged a meeting for her with an executive from a major music label, someone he knew personally. It wasn't a handout. He was very clear about that. It was an investment. He was investing in the spark he had seen on the napkin. Tears welled up in Anjali's eyes, blurring the elegant typed words. She couldn't believe it. This couldn't be real. It felt like a dream, a wonderful, impossible dream. All this time, she had been feeling like she was fading away, like the best part of her was gone forever. And this man, this complete stranger, had seen it. He had seen it in a single sentence written on a napkin. Why? Anjali finally asked, her voice choked with emotion. Why would he do this for me? Amit smiled kindly. He would say he's not doing it for you. He's doing it for the music. He's doing it because the world deserves to hear the song of the woman who hears the sad song that everyone else pretends not to. Anjali looked down at the business card, at the name of the record label, at the phone number typed so neatly below. The loose thread she had been worrying for 2 days had finally been pulled, and it hadn't unraveled her world. It had unraveled a new one, a world she thought was closed to her forever. The note hadn't just been a test. It had been a key, and it had just unlocked a door she had been staring at for years, never daring to believe she could open it. The world didn't change overnight. The sun still rose, her daughter still needed breakfast, and the rent was still due. But something profound had shifted inside Anjali, a subtle but powerful rearrangement of her own universe. The business card and the letter from Vikram Roy lived in her top drawer, tucked inside an old shoebox with a few faded photographs and her daughter's first baby booties. Some nights she would take them out, just to feel the heavy, crisp paper, to read the words over and over, convincing herself that it wasn't a hallucination, brought on by diner fumes and exhaustion. The first phone call was terrifying. She waited 3 days, her finger hovering over her phone's screen, rehearsing what she would say. What if it was all a mistake? What if Amit, the kind man in the suit, had the wrong person? What if she had completely misunderstood everything? Finally, on a rainy evening, with her daughter happily distracted by a cartoon, she took a deep breath and dialed the number. A friendly voice answered. A woman named Priya who worked for Amit. She confirmed everything. The studio session was booked for 3 weeks from Tuesday. The meeting with the music executive was scheduled for the following afternoon. It was all real. The reality of it hit Anjali so hard she had to sit down on her small kitchen floor, her head spinning. The life she had been mourning, the dreams she had buried, was reaching out a hand to her, asking her to take it. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of quiet preparation. She didn't quit her job at the diner. That would have been foolish, an arrogant leap of faith she couldn't afford. But her shifts there felt different. The greasy spoon was no longer a prison. It was a library. Every face in the crowd was a potential lyric, every murmur a possible melody. She carried a small notebook in her apron, and during slow moments, she would scribble down fragments of thoughts, lines of poetry, observations about the world unfolding around her. The guitar that had been collecting dust was now her constant companion. After her daughter fell asleep, the apartment, once a place of quiet anxiety, was filled with the soft strumming of strings and the hum of a woman rediscovering her voice. The day of the studio session arrived, bright and clear. Anjali felt a sickening mix of excitement and terror. She took the bus to the address Priya had given her, a part of the city she had only ever seen in magazines. The building was all glass and steel, a gleaming monument to creativity. She felt painfully out of place in her simple dress and worn-out cardigan. But when she walked inside, a young woman with bright pink hair and a huge smile greeted her by name. "Anjali, we're so ready for you. Come on back." The studio was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't a dark, smoky room full of brooding rock stars. It was bright, clean, and filled with more buttons and dials and blinking lights than she could comprehend. In the center of it all, though, was a beautiful, gleaming acoustic guitar, just waiting for her. And behind the huge glass window, sitting calmly at the mixing board, was a man with kind eyes and a beard. This was the producer Vikram Roy had arranged. His name was David. "Hi, Anjali," he said, his voice warm through the speakers. "Don't be nervous. Just pretend this is your living room. We're just here to listen." For the first hour, she couldn't play. Her fingers were stiff, her mind blank. She felt like an imposter. This man was a professional, a hitmaker. What could she possibly play for him that would be good enough? David was patient. He didn't push. He just talked to her about her daughter, about the diner, about the rain. He asked her about the note on the napkin. When she told him about it, about the sad song on the jukebox, something clicked. Okay. Forget about making a hit. Forget about me. Forget about everything. Just sing me the song that the jukebox plays, the one nobody listens to. She picked up the beautiful guitar. The wood was smooth and resonant beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes, and instead of seeing the hundreds of dials and buttons, she saw the sunrise diner. She saw the lonely trucker, the retired teacher, the awkward first-date couple. She saw the rain on the window. And she began to play. The song that came out wasn't one she had written before. It was new, born right there in that moment. It was a simple melody with words about the quiet sorrows people carry, the unseen weight on their shoulders, the shared silence in a crowded room. It was about the jukebox playing its heart out to an audience of ghosts. Her voice, which had been shaky and small at first, grew stronger with every line. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was the realest thing she had ever done. When she finished, the last note hanging in the air of the silent studio, she opened her eyes. David was looking at her through the glass, and he had a huge grin on his face. He gave her 2 thumbs up. In that moment, Anjali felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She hadn't failed. She hadn't embarrassed herself. She had done it. She had finally sung her song. The story doesn't end with a record deal and a stadium tour. The meeting with the music executive went well, but it was just the beginning of a very long, uncertain road. Life didn't magically become easy. Anjali was still a single mother trying to make ends meet. She still worked shifts at the diner on weekends, but everything was different. The struggle was no longer a grind. It was fuel. The ache in her heart was no longer a source of pain, but a well of inspiration. The true ending of the story comes a few months later. It's a quiet evening, and the apartment is filled with the warm, golden glow of a single lamp. Anjali's daughter is asleep in her room. The studio recording of her song, the one about the jukebox, is playing softly from a speaker on the shelf. It's a rough mix, but it sounds beautiful. Anjali is sitting on her couch, the notebook in her lap, a guitar resting beside her. She's not thinking about bills or the future or becoming a star. She's just writing, humming a new melody, weaving a new story. Vikram Roy, the man who put her on the spot, hadn't measured her worth in tips or service. He had measured it in the depth of a single honest observation. He had seen the songwriter hidden inside the tired waitress. He didn't give her a fortune or a fairy tale. He gave her something much more valuable. He gave her back her voice. And in the quiet of her small apartment, with her own song playing softly in the background, Anjali was, for the first time in a very long time, truly and completely home.